You're very welcome back. Now, our next guest is an award-winning author and journalist who's made her success by embracing her failures. In 2018, she shot to fame with the hit podcast How to Fail, which has since received a massive 13 million downloads, allowing her to get personal with stars like Phoebe Waller-Bridge and Lily Allen.
Now she's going even deeper with a new book, Failosophy, bringing together a guide of the lessons that she's learned and celebrating the fact that failure connects us all. Elizabeth Day joins us on the line. Good morning, Elizabeth. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us this morning. How are you?
Hi, Elizabeth.
Oh, I'm great. It's so lovely to be talking to you. Thank you for having me on.
Not at all. It's a pleasure. I love that description that failure connects us all. You might just discuss that first of all, and then we'll go back and talk about your career, which started as a journalist. But tell us about this idea about failure connecting us all, because we all do it all the time.
Exactly. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It's the idea that failure, many people are scared of it, and many people don't take risks because of their fear of failure. But when you realise that failure is inevitable and failure happens to us all, it's actually quite democratising and quite liberating. So it kind of it gives you the opportunity to take the risk and to grow and evolve. And I've just noticed through doing the podcast and writing the book that when people are open about their vulnerabilities and they discover that those vulnerabilities actually have great universal resonance, they discover that that's where the source of our shared strength is, because there's a great deal of solidarity in that kind of connection.
But Elizabeth, aren't we great at saying, you know, I'm delighted to announce whatever career you do, I suppose, but looking at our own career, between the three of us, let's say, in our business, we're great at saying, I'm delighted to announce that I'm taking part in X, Y, or Z, or I've landed this gig, or I'm writing this book, or I'm hosting this podcast. We don't ever say, I'm delighted to tell you that I've sent off 54 emails this week and, you know, 2 of them have been replied to, and I got turned down for 3 other jobs. Like, we're a bit crap at doing that, aren't we?
We are, and we must get better at doing it. And I think it's because, Anna, as you rightly identify, we live in a culture of curated perfection. And, you know, I love social media and I love Instagram in many ways, but it also has a darker side in that sometimes it can feel as though you're only as good as your last filtered post of you doing a perfect yoga move on a beach at sunset whilst also nailing a high-flying career. And that's difficult for the rest of us because we're comparing our insides. Like, we all know how neurotic and unsuccessful we think we are, but we're comparing our inside knowledge with everyone else's outsides. And I just wanted to create a safe space where people could talk about those 54 emails that they sent that didn't get a reply and the jobs that they didn't get, and how, looking back on those failures, weirdly enough, most times people are grateful for them because a failure sometimes is a nudge from the universe in a different direction. Sometimes it brings you face to face with who you really are and what you really want, rather than the person you were pretending to be.
And isn't it strange, Elizabeth, that we see people from all kinds of genres of business, sport, entertainment. Sir Alex Ferguson famously said, you know, that you learn more from losing a match than you do from winning a game. And we always hear about the most successful people in the world who, when they fail regularly, it's what they've learned and how they bounce back from that failure that makes them the person that they are. So do we need to take that on a smaller level to ourselves to improve ourselves as people, that we should learn more from our daily failures?
I definitely think so. And you're so right to identify sports people, because Michael Jordan's another great example, the basketball player. He says that he can only take the successful shots that he takes because of what he's learned from the failed shots that didn't go into the net. And I had Dame Kelly Holmes, the Olympic athlete, on the podcast, and she said, you know, you must always train for the outcome. Whatever the outcome is, your training has to be about coping with what that will eventually be. And I thought that that was such an amazing way to look at something, because it's about acceptance of whatever the outcome will be. And I think that our everyday failures can be seen as data acquisition in many ways, that we are acquiring necessary data for what to do right the next time. So in the same way that a scientist, say they're trying to develop a vaccine for a global pandemic, you know, a scientist would not think that they were a personal failure if their experiment did not work. They would think, oh, that's great, I've acquired some necessary data about what doesn't work, and that will bring me closer to the thing that does. And I think that that mindset can be applied in so many different areas of life, because what it does is it removes the personal sting of failure from the moment itself. Because just because you fail does not make you a failure. It makes you human.
And you have those 7 principles, Elizabeth, in the book, and we've just brought them up on screen as well. Failure is just a fact is the first one, which you've just touched on. We're all going to experience it many times probably in our lives. The second one is that you're not your worst thoughts. Imagine switching off all of those thoughts. That's so important, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it's the foundational principle of Buddhism and meditation. And if you're like me, guys, like I'm not great at meditation, and I find the very idea of it quite intimidating. But I was lucky enough to interview a Buddhist super monk on the podcast. And he said, you know, the very fact that you're already worried about how to meditate means that you're observing the thoughts. And you sort of need to disconnect from the thoughts that serve you and the thoughts that don't. So sometimes your brain gets caught on an anxious loop. It's the equivalent of the smoke alarm going off and your automatic assumption is that the house is burning down, when actually it's just a piece of toast in the toaster. And it's about identifying between thoughts that serve you, that are insightful, that are experiential, that can offer you something useful, and thoughts that don't, which is often the kind of anxious, panic thoughts that are just telling you that you're rubbish. And I interviewed an amazing man called Mo Gaudat. He developed an algorithm for happiness. And he said that one of the first steps to being happy is to name your brain. So he named his brain Becky. And apologies if there are any Beckys watching this morning, but he calls his brain Becky. And when Becky gets caught on an anxious loop and is saying, you know, Mo, you're rubbish, you're a failure, no one likes you, he stops himself and he says, Becky, I'd like you to provide objective evidence for that assertion. Because if you don't have objective evidence, I would like you to take that negative thought and replace it with a positive one. And in that way, it's a very kind of pragmatic way of training your brain to be more contented with life as it actually is.
Of course. You know, for normal people, it's nice to see the likes of yourself or Phoebe Waller-Bridge or Fern Cotton, Lily Allen actually have failures too, because it makes us all feel a little bit more normal. What was your experience with the likes of Phoebe, like someone that we would perceive as hugely successful?
Well, Phoebe's a really interesting example, actually, because she was my first ever guest on the podcast. And I'm lucky that she happens to be a friend of mine. So she agreed to it, even though she didn't know what she was getting herself into. So I spoke to her the first time, just when the first series of Fleabag had come out. And then she returned a year later, during which she had become, on the outside anyway, one of the most successful and famous women on the planet. And I was super interested to find out how that felt like, because I knew that she didn't feel that it had just been a smooth path to success, that there had been failures along the way. And part of the premise of the podcast is getting these people who seem so successful on paper, who seem to have it all, who seem to be our kind of modern gods on the red carpet, surrounded by glitz and glamour. And to get them to admit that actually it wasn't always like that. They did have patches of vulnerability. They did have periods of time when things went wrong, because I believe that that's aspirational and hopeful for the rest of us. I have to say, alongside that, I do interview people who aren't household names as well, because I also believe that they have incredible stories to tell. And I really am just interested in the whole gamut of failure. I'm a very nosy person.
Well, the podcast is going from strength to strength. You know, the downloads are well up in the millions. And the books, you're on your second book now, but you started as a journalist. I mean, you know, you don't seem to be a woman who's mired into plans. You know, you like your life to go off in tangents. As a journalist, was it always the plan to become a writer, become a novelist?
Yes, it was actually. So I grew up in the north of Ireland, just outside Derry, and my first ever job was as a columnist on the Derry Journal at the age of 12. So there was a lovely editor.
Holy moly.
No, there was a lovely editor called Pat McCart, and I knew that I wanted to be a writer, and I pitched the idea of a children's column. He was kind enough to say yes. So I did know that I wanted to be a writer, but like many people, I had a very clear sense of planning. Like, I was someone who always used to have a 5-year plan. And in my head, I thought I was going to be a kind of political correspondent. You know, I used to watch those films which featured sort of incredibly like successful female political correspondents uncovering stories of corruption. And I never actually became that kind of journalist. I became a feature writer, and then I wrote novels. And professionally speaking, I realise that it is incredibly absurd sometimes to hear me talk about failure, because I know that I've been privileged enough to have professional success. And I'm privileged as a person in terms of, I'm the fact that I'm white and middle class and have a roof over my head.
Well, that led you on a path to where you are today. And for us, it means we get the podcast and we get these incredible books that you're producing as well. Listen, thanks for your time, Elizabeth. Really appreciate it. And best of luck with everything in the future.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Now, Elizabeth's new book, Failosophy, is available now online and in all good bookshops nationwide.
Right, we'll take a quick break, but you can join us over in the kitchen next.